probably one of the most intimidating things, and the three of us have experienced this pretty well, which is you can find 1,001 players. It's harder to find somebody who's going to run the game itself.
Very true. To that, I would say, if you're a player, if you've enjoyed playing tabletop RPGs, and you've never ran a game in whatever system is your soup du jour, if you will, just consider it, please. We want to play so bad. We just want to play. But no, honestly, give it a shot. Like, if you've got a group that you trust and you've been with them for a while or even just a little bit, give it a shot. And if they're mean, let me know and I'll come kick them in the shins or something.
Just a reminder, this is a spoiler-heavy podcast. Different series that require a spoiler warning will be in the description. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Gaming Theater Podcast. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about helpful hints to start being a tabletop game master, or basically GMing 101. This is the episode that we've been talking about doing, which is to help out people who haven't game mastered a tabletop game. And so these are super helpful hints that should be able to be worked with almost any system on it. And so if you've ever game mastered a game before, a good way to start or to know what things that you might want to keep an eye out and to ease yourself into that. And to help me out with this, I've got two of my favorite game masters on the podcast, and let's us introduce ourselves on this. And once again, my name is Leo. I am the Geek Scorpio.
Hello, my name is DandDaine. I'm a game master. I don't know why that was awkward for me. I'm sorry. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop games for near on 20 years. I'm also a Twitch streamer where I do run some tabletop games on occasion, hoping to run more.
That did feel a little bit like an AA. Like, hi, my name is Rob, and I'm a game master.
Hi, Rob.
But no, I'm Rob. I do a little bit of voice acting for Gaming Theater. I am a game design student, and I'm also running the upcoming Gaming Theater role plays, which hopefully you get to hear our players muddle through their own adventures. But I've also been a game master for about 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. Long enough that I would have to do math to figure it out.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I said 20 years because it was a nice round number. I don't know if that's like, there's probably more, right? But like, I'm just going to go with 20.
That's okay. I'm like, figure out how much Dan is doing, cut it in half. That's your number, Leo.
Aww.
But anywho, before we get started, let's take a trip to the magical merch booth.
Whoa.
Yeah. Here we are with the magical merch booth, and as appropriately mentioned, apparently they have manuals and dice and an awfully large assortment of pencils and paper, and it looks like they're wanting to show off a couple new games that you're working on, Rob. So why don't you tell us about a new podcast channel that we are starting soon?
Yep, that's right. Gaming Theater Role Plays, or GTRP. We're going to be running a game using the Cortex Classic system mixed with the Cortex Prime system, or as I'm affectionately referring to it, Franken-Cortex, where we've combined the best of both. Anyway, our players are playing as members of the Andreas Cauldron Police Department, a fantasy city with elves and dwarves and wands that also has a functioning police department that deals with things like murder and illegal street racing. It's going to be a fun time for all, so hopefully you'll join in and listen to our players do incredible things and screw up royally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sold. Where can we find that?
You can find it anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as well as anywhere that Gaming Theater podcasts or other Gaming Theater things are listened to.
Yep, and I'll put links over those other channel stuff in the description. So as well, we'll probably even expand to other such systems, such as Dungeons & Dragons, GURPS, the massive amounts of different role-playing games that are out there. But for now, let's get our way back to the show. Okay, so with this, this, like I said before, is mostly for people who have never game mastered a game before. Game mastering, in its general terms, you've probably heard it before as dungeon mastering, but that's specific to Dungeons and Dragons. But game mastering is sort of the general term for being the guy in charge, the person who's running, narrating the storyline, as opposed to the players who are playing through the game that you have. Now, probably one of the most intimidating things, and the three of us have experienced this pretty well, which is you can find 1,001 players. It's harder to find somebody who's going to run the game itself.
Very true. To that, I would say, if you're a player, if you've enjoyed playing tabletop RPGs and you've never ran a game in whatever system is your soup du jour, if you will, just consider it, please. We want to play so bad. We just want to play. But no, honestly, give it a shot. Like, if you've got a group that you trust and you've been with them for a while or even just a little bit, give it a shot. And if they're mean, let me know and I'll come kick them in the shins or something.
Yeah, I think every player who plays D&D should GM at least once.
100%.
It's okay if it's not your thing. That's perfectly fine. But you should experience it at least once, if for no other reason than to understand what your GM is going through.
Well, I don't think it's asking too much necessarily, because I think that, and I don't think the players are at fault for this. I want to make that very clear. But I do think that there is sort of this thought of like, oh, well, you just create the story as you go along. Like, how hard could it be? How difficult could it be? And like, not that they intend it in a mean-spirited, the players intend it in a mean-spirited or malicious way, but like running a game, at least at the beginning, and even sometimes even to the end, is difficult. It's work. It's as little or as much work as you need to put into it, right? But there are, prepping a session of D&D for me, I could do no prep, but typically I do about an hour or two per game of prep, just for my own like peace of mind. It's not necessary. It's not needed. I probably could muddle my way through it well enough with just the thoughts in my head. But, that's 2 hours out of my life that I'm fitting in between work and school and home life and other obligations and, that I could free up. But running a game is a lot of work. And I think that even just having that realization as a player, because you might think right? But until you're like in the hot seat being like, there's a goblin. He's 6 feet tall. I don't know why. His name? Jim the Goblin, and he's a carpenter. Like, until you're like in that moment, it's hard to really, I think, understand, other than on a conceptual level, how much work running a game actually is.
And not to scare anyone off, because the fact of the matter is, yes, it's work, but it's also fun.
It's so rewarding.
Like,
it's so rewarding.
I enjoy playing as much as the next guy. I would so much rather be GMing in almost every instance. And I don't think I would have thought that from the get-go. From when I first started playing, I probably wouldn't have realized how much fun it was. But because I gave it a shot and realized, this is a lot of work, but oh my gosh, I'm enjoying it so much, you might have that realization too, and you'll never know until you try.
Yeah, and I think for Rob, I think you're probably feeling similar to the way I am, and Leo, I'm sure you feel similar as well. When you put a story beat in front of your players, or you create a scene, or you go through a scenario, whatever the system looks like, and you see their face light up, and they're like, I can do this thing, or like, oh, I do this thing, or like that. They have that like
that aha moment, like
like a gotcha moment where they're like, they think they've got one over on you, and you're just like super stoked about it. It's the best feeling in the world when your friends or the people you're playing with, your soon to be friends, because hopefully you're playing games with your friends, whether they're new friends or old friends. Hopefully they're your friends. Everyone deserves to game with friends, I think. But yeah, when they're just like, haha, I cast fireball, and you're like, oh no, my carefully laid plan. And you ham it up a little bit, but like, it's the best feeling in the world.
I think that is probably the second most entertaining thing in the world. The first most entertaining in the world thing to me is when I hit players with a curveball that they genuinely did not see coming.
Oh, that's really good too. That's a good feel too.
A good feeling that
Yeah,
I have is usually when I watch my players use the similar tactics to beat like all of my puzzles, and then they put and this it's very advanced game mastering. If you can pull it off, it's so rewarding to watch them panic for a second because they realize they cannot solve this problem by punching their way out of this.
Yes.
And
throwing carefully constructed roadblocks, whether it's combat, social, or other encounters, because not every encounter, just as a note, needs to be a combat scenario, right? I've had way more fun playing politic and watching my players sweat as they're, fighting socially this baron who they can't just murder outright because there'll be consequences. They have to like play 4D chess with this guy, and I'm just sitting there like steepling my fingers, laughing maniacally. But yeah, I think all three of the things that we've put forth here feel incredible, and I think they match, for me at least, they match, if not exceed, the excitement I get from getting like a cool crit or a cool moment or a cool, scene in whatever game I'm playing, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or otherwise. There's nothing like it. That exhilaration when your players are like, oh my god, I can do this thing, or like, oh, we've got you, DM, haha, take that, and you're like, no, my plans, oh god,
or they have to take one big gamble and hope for the best, and it barely pays off.
And it pays off. Oh my god, or they roll like a nat 20 if it's D&D, or like they get a critical success in whatever system it is. Like I'm celebrating with them. Like they're screwing me over technically because I don't agree in the whole like adversarial GM mindset. I don't think that the game master or dungeon master is there to be an enemy to the players, but like sometimes we're playing the bad guys. That happens, and like seeing them be like, okay, either certain death or I'm going to succeed, and it all comes down to that one roll, and it works. You're just like, oh my god, it's so cool.
As a good GM, you would basically be we're in it with you. We're in it with all the players on that. If you're winning and we're having a good time, it's all a good time there.
And I think that's a good thing before we get into kind of the minutia to mention that, like, as a GM, I think you should be intrinsically tied to the happiness of your players. Because as long as, like, and you should be having fun too, don't get me wrong, it should not just be their fun. But as long as your players are having fun, you'll probably have fun as a game master.
Yeah, I think for a lot of GMs when they're first starting out, when you've only seen it from the player's side, it's easy to think it's GM versus players. It's easy to think they're trying, I've set out these things, but really that's not what it's about. The goal isn't to beat your players.
No.
The goal isn't even for your players to beat the monsters, although that's often what winds up happening. The goal is to have fun, and fun can be a lot of different things. It is fun to beat a big boss monster that had this cool move set, but it's also sometimes fun to fail. It's fun to have your character have this dramatic death that has a meaningful impact on the story. Yeah. That's fun too. It's fun to convince that Baron to finally give you those resources that you need to help him out. It's fun to catch the murderer and turn him over to the police. There's all sorts of things that are fun and enjoyable that, it's not just the fun of, I have this monster and my players are going to beat it, and that is inherently fun. There's so many ways to have fun.
Yes. And that's the joy of TTRPG. Like, at the end of the day, you're sitting around a table making make-believe with your friends. Like, and that's amazing, and it's great, and it's wonderful. But yeah, like, the adventure can be anything. Your successes, your failures, anything. It's so cool.
So fun.
I love this hobby.
So yeah, so here's some of the things that you want to do. And as a GM, a game master, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be the one who's leading this. We're going to go through a couple little hints, things that I think you're. Number one, and this is the way I've always figured it out, figure out what kind of game that you want to play. Like what settings, what world, which way you want to go. One of the funnest campaigns I've had is in Western. Then I've also had games that take place as a science fiction or a sci-fi Western, like Firefly type situation. But understand the role that you want to do. Now, the reason why I think this is important because gives people expectations. It was something I read in the Cortex system, which they make a note about, which I always thought was interesting. If you can figure out, or what type of area that you're working with, you can figure out what things you can just assume is going to happen. So, for example, if you are taking place of your setting in anything that's about, let's say 1600s, 1700 and going on, or higher, reading and writing is a base skill that most people just have. So you never have to worry about people making a check for this.
Yeah.
Or and this came up. We were doing a sci-fi campaign. I'm like, and one of the skills is how to fly a shuttle craft. I'm like, do we need a skill? Not if you're grocery shopping or something like that. You would probably just know how to do that because that's how that world works. Or like in a modern setting, like today, we won't really consider driving as a, even though in real life driving is a learned skill that you have to figure out. But for the purpose of the game, there's no reason to roll for it unless it's like a high-speed car chase or anything like that.
Like in modern times, most people know how to drive a car. They don't know how to drive a car over a ramp and successfully land a jump, but they know how to get down to the grocery store and back.
You're not wanting to play the game as a medieval fantasy. Don't. You're not stuck with just your standard one. That's just how the game works out for it. And a lot of systems are very fluid to be able to move around for it, so you don't need to worry too much about it. But picking your setting is a good way to go. And most game masters end up, a lot of times, unfortunately, a game master will, once they get skilled enough, will be like, hey, I want to play X game, and finding players is not hard.
I will say
That's-
too. Oh God, Rob.
Yeah, that's one thing to know. If you want to be a game master, you will never have a problem finding a party. That's just how it works.
100%. And I will say too, being a game master is a design and is an exercise in flexibility.
Mm.
So, you may want to run this super awesome spaghetti space western a la Cowboy Bebop, Firefly, whatever. And you're like, man, I've got such this cool idea and it's amazing and I'm so excited for this storyline, da 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 da. And you start putting in hours and hours and hours of work and you're researching and you've got this whole, idea in mind. And then you take it to your players and they don't buy in. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this, I think, and some things that I think should be, you need to be flexible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would very much caution you against doing all of the groundwork without talking to the players or the people you want to play first.
Mm-hmm.
There's this thing called Session Zero, which has become more and more popular, which is amazing, where you sit down and you have a talk with your players about their expectations. What kind of game are they interested in? What kind of game are you interested in running? What are some topics that are okay? What are some topics that may not be okay? Because everyone's got different levels of comfortability in certain things. Maybe they've got a fear of space, so being a taut space-based game might not be great for them, as an example. So I think that while having an idea in mind and visualizing the setting and making sure that you know what kind of game you want to run, that is important. But also equally important is talking to your players to find out what game they want to play. And they may not care, right? But the conversation will not hurt you any.
Yeah.
I think.
More popular now is Session Zero, and I've ran several of those ones. It's really nice to get a sort of a feel of which way a person your players want to go. One of the things that I ran the Session Zero for was because I knew I was going to run a more modern day campaign. And I kind of wanted, but with like a supernatural, was like in the world of supernatural. And I was wondering if anyone in this campaign wanted to like if you've ever watched the show Supernatural, they touch on a lot of different concepts. And one of the things that they didn't want that my players didn't want to deal with was a human enemy. All the enemies had to be supernatural in nature. They didn't want to deal with some of the human stuff that is out there. And I get it. This is just that's not whether it's comfortable. And another person, which I was a player in, actually did something kind of interesting. They put up a sort of like a survey for their Session Zero. And the survey was how comfortable you are with these topics. So like how comfortable you are with true crime, how comfortable you are with sex scenes, how comfortable you are with other like criminal activities. And this was just sort of so the game master just knew what not to do, what things were or triggering, or things were just nobody wanted to deal with this. And that's fair.
Yeah, and I think that on that same note too, it's the best way to find out what your players are interested, what they do want to do. You know,
Mhm.
when you're wanting to tailor your game to be entertaining for your players, there's especially as a DM or a GM, and there's a lot of I need to keep this thing secret so I can surprise my players with it later. And that winds up seeping into a lot of places that it shouldn't. It winds up cutting off communication between your players a little bit.
Mhm.
And really, for a lot of stuff, the best thing is to just be open with your players, especially when you're talking about this. How do you know what kind of play or what kind of game your players want to play? You ask them.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
that's how you find the answer. You don't just have to like secretly observe. You can just say, "Hey, what are you interested in?"
Yeah, and sometimes this helps out because maybe they want a more combat focused campaign about a mystery or some kind of politicking or some kind of or and this is one of my favorite campaigns I got to run, which is simply we were all people who are wanting to assassinate one particular target, but our disguises were everyone was a maid inside this mansion, and so we all were
Hmm.
just it was our assistant called maid, and you were just a bunch of maids, but we turned it into a bad anime assassination plot because that's what we wanted to do for this.
Yeah.
And it was interesting ways to come up with it. It doesn't a session zero is just you talking to your players, and this helps a lot because it lets you talk to them outside of the game as a game session, so you can reserve time for it. Or even more importantly, how long or how engrossing is this game? Do you want this to be a one shot where I only got time to do this once and we call it a day, or a long streaming campaign, or something that should be free flowing where multiple players can just go in and out, or one that's has a single person as a focused character. And lots of things can be done that way.
Kind of on that note, when you're talking about running your very first session as a GM, I would very, very strongly recommend a one shot as opposed to a long drawn out campaign. You know, I'm not saying you shouldn't do the long campaign
Mhm.
eventually, but your first time GMing, there's going to be mistakes that happen. There's going to be a lot of things that you didn't think would come up that suddenly come up. And a one shot is a really good way to figure those things out without long term consequences. You know, you have this one shot and your players die. That's okay. Well, your player characters die. That's okay. It's a one shot. They weren't going to last beyond this session anyway. You know, you accidentally give them an incredibly powerful magical item that's totally game breaking. That's okay. This is a one shot. It's not going to be there next time. It's really important, I think, to have this be a one shot, so that way whatever you screw up or don't doesn't have long term consequences.
Mhm.
And then after you do your one shot, then you can start planning out. Okay, now I kind of know what I'm doing. Now let's do a longer campaign.
A little bit more of a minutia detail. I would agree. Kind of bouncing off what Rob said about magic items too. Like we're all establishing relationships here between the game master and the players, and as such, if you do something that breaks your game, let's say you give a level 1 adventurer a +3 Vorpal sword in D&D, like that's a strong item,
Mhm.
and that character is going to be pretty dang strong. And if you didn't think about it or you weren't sure the consequences of it, and you get to 2 or 3 sessions down the road from them having this object, and you go, oh no, like what have I done? There are ways that you can work around those things, right? You are not necessarily stuck. You can talk to your players and go, hey, this is what I intended for that item. It's proving a little bit strong. Can we adapt it? Can we change it? Can we work towards, maybe you only have a +1 Vorpal sword, or maybe you have a +1 sword that just crits more often, or, and then through the course of the narrative, we can power up your weapon back to where it was when I gave it to you. Would that be okay? Or, I mean, you have your hand on the dial, so you can ratchet up that difficulty or bring it down for the entire game. Maybe that person gets a really strong weapon or item, but then doesn't get anything else intended for them for a while. It's somebody else's turn. It's the rogue's turn, or the detective's turn, or whomever.
Mhm.
Um, you have the power to adapt your game to suit the needs of you and your players as long as they're in line.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid that if you've given a magical item in a one-shot and that one-shot becomes a campaign, that you're like, oh no, I gave them the Helm of Disintegration. They just disintegrate everything forever. It's like, okay, well, maybe now there's somebody making disintegrate proof items because this is an issue now.
Or they bump into a curse, which changes part of the item for it, or
Yeah.
readjust it. And flexibility is important. Like, if there's one key thing that you need to know as a game master, I believe being able to adjust is the way to go. If you make a mistake, don't worry about it. There are ways to fix it, like in game. If they can't fix it out of game, and ideally, your players aren't gonna fight you too much on it if they understand, like, hey, this is just super game breaking right now, and you're just going to psych the. You just have to limit that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's easy to worry about upsetting your players, but just remember these are your friends. Hopefully these aren't people who dislike you as a person.
Yeah.
That, and if they're unwilling to compromise or hear you out, maybe they're not your friends, and maybe you shouldn't be playing with them.
Or even
remember,
if
you're the GM. You're never going to have a problem finding new party members.
True. And even if they are your friends, maybe your game is not the game they should be in. Like, not every game is going to be perfect for every player. Some people like zaniness and silliness, and I want to be a sentient gingerbread cookie man, and like sometimes that's okay, but other times people want something a little bit more based in reality. And so, like, just because you're friends with these people doesn't mean you have to be in their game. First of all, but second of all, you can still be friends and not game together in this way. And maybe, the next game they run will be more your speed or more your style. You can be flexible. You have the ability to choose what game you play in. And I know that sounds silly and kind of like a no duh, but I think it bears saying.
It bears saying because this does come up. If you've gone on the internet and checked out any of these stories or even talked to people about stories about game mastering, some of them will have some that are a heartache. Some of them will have some that are just ridiculously stressful, and others have problems with it. But there's ways around it. There's ways to take care of it. And don't be afraid of those. Those are so rare and one-off. That's why people have stories about them, because they're so rare and one-off on that.
Yeah, it's easy to think because of the internet that all players you ever run across to are secretly problem players. But that's really not the case. Those are just, those are interesting stories when you have the player that did the crazy thing that really ticked everyone off.
Yeah.
But, that for a lot of people, they only have the one story because it just doesn't happen that often. Most of your players are reasonable people who also want to have fun.
Yeah. And if they're not, maybe your game isn't the right one for them, or maybe their playstyle isn't the right one for this specific game. And that's okay.
That's okay. So I think moving on from the next subject, which is number 2, that I think is an important thing. Now that you've talked to your players, figured out which way you want to go, I think number 2 would be a good way to know which system is the right one for your game. And we and Dane and Rob have talked about this before. It's not every system works well with the type of game that you're playing. That doesn't mean that there isn't one out there or that this can't be adjusted. For example, Cortex. One of the funniest things about it is it's very open-ended for it. But that open-ended is a double-edged sword. Just because you can do all these cool things, because even though you have a simple item, sometimes they're really, or a simple skill, sometimes they're really conflict. It also can hamstring you because you don't have that particular skill.
Cortex is wonderful because it's very flexible and open, and it can do a lot of different genres, and that's a problem because it can do a lot of different genres. And a lot of Cortex games, there are games that are set for like a specific show or franchise or whatever, but if you're just talking about the basic Cortex system, it does not come with its own setting. It does not. There's a lot of details that are left open for the GM to figure out. And for some GMs thrive on that. They love that. Others might find that very intimidating.
Like, one of the big strengths with Dungeons and Dragons, especially in 5e, is that a lot of things are spelled out for you. So because of that, though, there's a lot of things that you can just specifically do, which is really great. because sometimes you just want to have these combat scenarios and sessions on it, and Dungeons and Dragons works with that really well because it's all laid out the way that you need to in its description.
Yeah, I mean,
And-
Dungeons and Dragons has a big old list of monsters that you can just pick from, and it tells you, hey, this is how difficult this monster is for a party of this level. And here's a whole big old list of magical items, potential rewards that you can be giving your players. You know, it's stuff that you don't have to figure out yourself.
Mhm.
It's just there for you to pick from. And that is really, really nice sometimes.
And games like Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder do have their own rule sets, which are fairly clear a lot of the time. But there are still some like weird edge cases and some weird rulings that like you have to make a call on. It's not going to be spelled out for you. It's like, well, okay, does this make sense if X, Y, and Z? Yeah, I guess it does, or oh no, it doesn't. That won't necessarily be spelled out in the books for you. You know, like they have no idea how much damage. Like there's a guideline for how much damage a cow does if you drop it from orbit onto your enemy.
Mhm.
But in practice, like there's some things that I think realistically would have to go into that thought process of like, where's this cow coming from? Magic? Okay. Does it burn up on reentry in the atmosphere? Like, I mean, and this is a silly example, but there are some things that will not be included in the rulebook, even in games like D&D and Pathfinder that are a bit more spelled out, that eventually you will get more comfortable just making a ruling on, being like, no, I don't think that works that way. Or, oh, yeah, I could see that. That's a good argument.
Yeah, one thing in particular with D&D I think that it struggles with is there aren't really rules for social encounters.
No.
You know,
please.
Dungeons and Dragons is a fantastic game, and it's very, very popular for good reason. It's a well thought out system for what it does, and what it does is exploring dungeons and fighting monsters like dragons. You know, if you have a social encounter with, you know, a nobleman or a merchant or just an urchin on the street using Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, yeah, you absolutely can. But that's not what the system is designed for. And so if socialization is going to be the main thing that you're doing in your campaign or in your session or whatever, maybe D&D is not the right choice for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to be honest, you know, I love the Cortex systems, excuse me, but they are not very crunchy.
They are not.
There is not a lot of crunch to them. If you are a person who likes rolling a bunch of dice and adding things up and having like numbers in front of you that equate to things, Cortex may not be the right system for you. But if you want like a narrative storytelling vibe, Cortex is incredible.
There's one.
Not to say that Cortex doesn't have crunch. It just has not as much crunch as other systems potentially out there.
Yeah, there's,
You know,
As an
you're
example.
not leveling up your character and picking from a dozen different things that your character class can do.
Yeah. Like GURPS is one that's so fluid. It's designed to use everything, but sometimes just staring at all those numbers for things I may never ever use in this game.
Yeah. It can be overwhelming. I mean, Shadowrun.
Shadowrun, yeah.
Like,
Oh my gosh, Shadowrun.
you have to have a degree to understand Shadowrun, and I don't.
Oh,
I love Shadowrun. It's great. It's amazing. And some people out there might be like, well, it's not that hard for me. And like, if you're one of those people, dope. Run with it.
Yeah.
But like, I get lost in Shadowrun in both a good and a frustrating way.
Cyberpunk. I was looking over the books for that one because I was thinking about running a Cyberpunk campaign, and I'm sitting there getting kind of lost because of how their system works out. Like, it makes sense to read it, and the reason why it makes sense is I couldn't run a regular campaign because I'm not used to the net hacking faction thing that you have to deal with, and it's
Sure.
a big deal in Cyberpunk. And so because of that, I had to reread those rules again, like several times on it before it finally crunched in my head. But it makes sense for that world because there's a cyberpunk aspect to it. It's not a straight combat one like Dungeons and Dragons are, which is fine. That's the way that system works with.
Yeah, and I think what this really illustrates, even just the couple of systems, and there are so many more other games out there that you can explore. If you are into anything, there's probably a TTRPG for you, whether it's, you know, anime robot cat girls or Murder Most Foul. Like, hopefully not murdering real people, just murder your friends on paper, just as a disclaimer here. But you can find a game that will fit your style and your theme and what you're interested in. It's out there, I promise you.
Yeah.
I mean, during the pandemic, just to give a quick example, I kickstarted, I think, 5 or 6 different systems, from a heist game to an Avatar: The Last Airbender based game to you throw a rock at a property or an idea that you like, and there's going to be a system out there for you. I can't speak to the quality of it necessarily.
That's a different conversation.
Yeah, but there's probably something out there. And if there's not, chances are there's a system out there that you can adapt to do the lifting of what you need.
Yeah, some of them are really weird ones. Like, if you want one that's kind of a similar narrative, one that was interesting that I bumped into was they have 2 different, like, it's made by the same company, but Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles has 2 completely different systems for their world. One that's before an apocalypse and one that's after an apocalypse. And that is a short story that happened once in TMNT, but they had a whole camp. But there was a tabletop about that.
That's cool.
A weird one that I bumped into was I bumped into a Buffy the Vampire Slayer campaign, and the reason why it was weird to me was because the game can't start unless one person picks to be the Slayer, but they can only have one Slayer in the game at any given time.
Interesting. So are the rest kind of like supporting cast?
Everyone else is support, or they call white hats in that game. So everyone else can play, and the Slayer is guaranteed to have stats that are a bit bigger than everyone else because of that. But you can only have one.
Interesting.
And so we're talking about, different systems and their strengths and weaknesses. But what should you use for your game? The short answer, and honestly, I feel like the most important answer, is the system you are most familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Whatever works best for you.
If you have been playing in D&D for a long time and now you want to GM and you're sitting there like, what system should I choose? You should choose D&D, because your first game isn't necessarily about, picking the right setting, the right world. Your first game is meant to get you used to the idea of GMing. Mm-hmm. And that's easiest to do if you know the system well.
100%. Now, that doesn't mean
that there's nothing wrong with...
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I think we're on the same boat. There's nothing wrong with just picking up, because I've done that and just dived headfirst into a new system. And sometimes that's kind of a weird experience to it, because everyone else who might be playing with you is diving headfirst into this new system. So are you doing anything wrong? Who knows?
Yeah, and there could be some frustrations with that, right? Not knowing the game may not be as smooth. There are some pros and cons, right, to both approaches. If you use the D&D example, if you've been playing D&D, you know D&D, you might be more comfortable running D&D, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if your group is kind of like, D&D is great, but we really want to try something else, that's also really good. And I think that the 3 of us have played a wide variety of systems, and that it bears repeating that try different systems. Mm-hmm. I love D&D. D&D was my first tabletop RPG. It's always going to be near and dear to my heart. I've played every edition so far of D&D and hope to continue that trend until I cease to be. But it's not the best game for everything, and it's not the only game out there. There's a lot of good ones. Mm-hmm. A lot of good ones.
Like my first...
And honestly, using a new system like that, where your players are maybe constantly playing one style, is actually a really good way to get your foot in the door as a GM. Mm-hmm. It's just like, we've been playing D&D. Hey guys, why don't we try this other system that I found? I think it's pretty neat. I know it's not our usual style, but I'd like to try my hand at GMing, and I'd like to try this new game. That's a great way to get in with players that you already know, that you have already played with. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely great for a one shot too, because it's just like, hey, let's try this system just this once. And whether or not it works out, that's fine. We can go back to our regular weekly game after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, especially because as DMs and GMs, and this will come up a little bit later. I think I'm jumping the shark just a little bit, but like burnout is something that you are always going to have to combat.
Yes.
In any sort of creative field, not just tabletop RPGs, but burnout is hard in general. But it can also be hard as a game master. And so, let's say in the example given of, hey, can we try out this different system just this once? It's like a one shot, and then we can go back to our regular scheduled game. If you're a player in a game and you're interested in running a game, talk to your GM, talk to your DM, and be like, hey, Susie, I'm considering running this game. I found this system. I'm really interested in it. Do you think there's a point that you would like a break as the DM? Would you like to play in a one shot, or what have you, and just see what the system's like? Is there a point coming up where the story could
Take
uh,
a break.
season
Yeah.
wrap? Yeah, like the season is over, right? The end credits roll. We've defeated the big bad, but we're going to be back for the next season later, and this will give you time to prep or plan for your next steps. Because sometimes you as a DM or a GM, you just need a week or two off
Oh,
from
good
thinking
lord, yeah.
about the game.
I'll be honest, as a GM, that's like my biggest flaw. And you'll see, if anyone has played with me, when the campaign starts going really long, my first couple of sessions are such amazing. Everyone's having a fun time. Once we start getting to the end, it starts declining because I'm tired of having to come up. I'm getting more and more exhausted trying to come up with newer sessions to keep the story going.
Yeah, you need a break.
And I need a break.
You need someone else to come in and run something. Or, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a tabletop game, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe for a week you do a board game night, or a month you do a board game night, where you still get together and hang out and connect as friends, but you don't have to run a tabletop game, or the person who has been running doesn't have to run.
Yeah, like that's what got me introduced into the game system for Made, and I think it's Magic Shop is the other name for it. Yeah, and so like because I could throw it together as a quick one shot because the game master I was the dungeon master I was working with was stuck and was going to be out of town for a week. I'm like, but everybody wanted to play. I'm like, I could throw something together on this one, and I did. It was a way easy thing I could just throw together.
Yeah, Made is not for everyone. It's a little bit risque. It's definitely a niche thing, but it's if you're up for that, it's super easy to set up. It is designed really for one shots,
but it's not too great on a major campaign. Things move because Made can move really fast, where campaigns need to slow down a bit.
Well, I think to kind of go off that too, there are a number of like free resources or very inexpensive resources, relatively speaking, that one can find. I mean, there are one-page tabletop RPG games, a whole system on one page.
Oh yeah.
So anything by Grant Howitt is incredible. He does a bunch of things like Trash Pandas, Goat Crashers, Sexy Battle Wizards. What I did on my summer holidays. Like if you look Grant Howitt up, there are so many one-page RPGs that this person has invented for all walks of life. Honey Heist is one of their famous ones, where you are literally bears at a honey convention trying to steal honey, and you have to like blend in between being a bear and being a person. So you have like your stat is either bear or a criminal is the other aspect of that. And if you get too far on the criminal, you betray your people. And if you get too far on the bear, you go feral and like have to be tranquilized and removed from the convention. And like that's ridiculous.
That is so.
But for like a night of make believe and fun, it's incredible.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
It's a lot of fun. And like Trash Pandas is about a bunch of raccoons who are street racers in downtown LA.
That's awesome. But yeah, there's different systems on there. Which way you want to go is really how you want to move on. I think number 3, the next one, and this is something that is really good to talk to, especially in a session 0, or let your players know far beforehand, which is decide basically how lethal, or basically how common death is going to be for your players going into it. The expectation for this is really the important right.
Well, I don't even know if like just kind of broaden the scope a little bit. Like deciding how lethal you want your game to be is in 100% something one should do. But also like what themes, we mentioned this in the session 0 talk, what themes are going to be in this game? Some people really want that, like if you're doing a cyberpunk game as an example, they want that like gritty real world, like dystopian feel where like people are impoverished and they are going through struggles and they have to do certain things to get by. Some people really like that. And for other people, they're like, I just wanted to play make believe with my friends. Like, could we not do like a gritty, realistic, everything is awful all the time game? And so I agree, like deciding how lethal you want it, what's the danger to the players, what's the danger to the characters, but also deciding like for lack of a better term, how lethal you want your themes to be.
Yeah.
How serious do you want the game to be? Is there going to be things like alcohol use, smoking, drinking, drugs, violence? What kind of violence and against whom? Like, there's a lot of things you have to go into that I think kind of falls under this banner as well. Like how much danger, whether physical danger, mental danger, spiritual danger, I suppose, do you want your players to go through?
Yeah.
And it needs to be discussed, because if there's a miscommunication, everybody feels bad about that.
There's a friend of mine who who, as a house rule, anytime that, because she really loves small animals, and anytime that a small animal would be mortally wounded or something would put it to being killed, it can't. It's not allowed to be, because she doesn't want to have to deal with that, and she loves animals far too much for it, and that's fair.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, there are some players that really want to experience the moral dilemmas, and they really want to look deep into the mirror and find out who they are as a person. And some people are playing games specifically to avoid that.
Yes.
Like, what was it? There was back in 2020, somebody invited me to a game or something, and one of the themes in it was going to be about a disease, and like, this is the pandemic. I'm out. I don't want to deal with that right now.
Yeah, and that's fair. But that's why we have to have these conversations. You have to have them ahead of time, because if you let's say Leo plans this super amazing virus zombie survival game, and it's during a point where, like, I don't have the bandwidth to deal with a serious zombie survival storyline, similar to The Last of Us or Walking Dead or whatever you want to point to. I need to know about that ahead of time, but Leo also needs to know about that, because he may lose me as a player, which is not a bad thing in and of itself, but like, it needs to be a conversation, because otherwise I get to the table and I'm like, let's play make-believe, yeah, awesome, and he's like, zombie apocalypse, super gritty, blah, and I'm like, whoa, hold on, I'm not comfortable. I'm not here for this kind of game. And like, inadvertently, I don't think through anyone's fault, I think it could lead to some like contentious moments and some hurt feelings potentially, where it's like, I just wanted to play games with my friends, but now I feel like I can't do that. And Leo's like, I worked really hard on this super awesome storyline, and now I can't run it, or I don't feel like I can run it.
Like, one of my favorite games, and it was Rob. It was a homebrew that Rob was running once, and he called it Endless Night, and it was nothing but horror film tropes going through this entire campaign.
That's right.
Now, the thing with it, though, and this was very important, Rob told us straight up, you will, if you die, there's not really a way to bring yourself back in game. Your character will be gone forever. So a lot of the players who were in there were playing a lot less recklessly, because they knew, this is it. My player is gone. Yeah. However, I played it like I normally played, and I died something like 10 times in the game, and I recreated a character every single time.
My favorite was when you made a character that died that session, and then made a new character to introduce before the session was over.
We just have to hide behind the pile of dead bards.
But I mean, sort of on that note, the truth is, a lot of players are going to become very, very attached to their characters. That's the nature of the game. You made a character, he's yours. Oh my gosh, I love him or her or it so much. And they're scared of losing that. It's a scary thing. And other players are just like, I made this character. I can't wait for them to have a dramatic death that really affects it. Some people want that, and you want to have that discussion beforehand.
Yeah.
You don't want to assume one when it's actually the other.
Yeah, and some players will put a bit more of themselves. Characters sometimes have a lot of connection to their player.
Yeah.
And they just sort of weirdly designed it that way. And because of that, they're more attached. So if they know beforehand that this character can go away, it's a lot easier to deal with it when instead of it just popping up out of the blue.
Well, I think it bears mentioning that you're going to make mistakes too.
Mhm.
Like, I don't want to scare anyone away.
Mm-mm.
Dungeon Mastering is a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun, and it's very rewarding. More so, most times, I would say, than being a player.
Oh yes.
But you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. You're going to have this like epic, cool, awesome moment in your head, and you're going to show it to your players, and sometimes you're not met with the reactions that you were assuming they would have. Because some people have things in their life that affect them differently than others, right?
Mhm.
So you might plan this super amazing, murder scene, and then you notice that one of your players has gone quiet or has backed off, is not really engaging anymore. Do not be afraid of stopping the game and checking in. Maybe you don't have to do it right then and there necessarily, but just in general, being like, hey everybody, I know it was really intense last session. We had that super crazy murder. How are we feeling? How are we doing? Is there any feedback you have for me? Please message me privately or in person, however you want to do it, whatever you're comfortable with. Checking in with your players, just like your DM should be doing with you or your
Mhm.
GM should be doing with you, is important. And if you make a mistake, it's a simple adage, right? But you can always apologize.
Yeah.
You can always, my bad, y'all. Shouldn't have done that super grisly murder scene
Mhm.
in our happy Care Bears game. I will know better moving forward. Here's how I would like to proceed if it's okay with you all.
And sometimes you'll be surprised with it. Like one campaign I ran, and some AI came back, and one person in our party was super attached to this AI that I developed, that I built. And
Mm-hmm.
my intention is one and done. At the end of this session, she is gone. She is trash.
Yeah.
And everyone's trying. By the end of that session, um, and I brought in the big bad that planned this whole thing out. They were so invested as the players into this thing that they wanted me dead in real life for this. Like
Yeah.
going, you hurt the, and I don't know how, but this AI, they're sweating bullets over this AI because I'm like, no, this thing is supposed to be trashed by the end of my plot, and they were trying anything and everything desperately to save it. And because of this shenanigans that happened, I brought them the big bad, but they could not fight the big bad right there without any consequences against that AI. And so
That is
death
another point.
glares.
Players just keep in mind we're people too. And
Yep.
like, yes, we're gonna mess with your favorite characters, and we're sorry about that. But we kind of needed to in the moment, and like,
In the
we
moment.
didn't want to hurt you. It was just kind of a consequence of what happened.
So after that session was done, I checked in on every one of my players, and to my surprise, everyone was like this. I wish that you would never do anything that desperate again. But man, I want to see where the rest of this is going. They're like,
Yeah.
you, and it's amazing.
I think something Dane mentioned earlier that I think is really, really important was private and public.
Yes.
You know, when one player is sort of withdrawing, don't talk to that player in public in front of everybody.
No.
Don't put them on the spot.
That's
talk
awful.
to them privately. Take them aside. Send them a text.
Mhm.
You know, or talk to them outside of game when everyone else is not present, and talk to them. There are things that they might want to say, but they don't want to say it in front of the rest of the group.
Yeah.
You know, maybe because they feel like they're the only ones that have that opinion, or you know, they're just, they don't want to ruin everyone else's fun with their own problems. Talk to them privately, but also give people an opportunity to talk publicly too. Some people are more likely to express their concerns if they've got friends next to them that they think are going to back them up.
Yep.
So really, if you're noticing problems, you want to have both opportunities for players to discuss them with you privately and to discuss them with you as.
Yeah, and I think as a DM, you need to be humble a little bit. It's hard.
Yeah.
You've created this amazing world. You've done amazing work. You know it's great. It's amazing. But, people don't always interact in the same way with things. People don't always have the same background or same experiences as others do, as I've mentioned before. And so I think being humble and going, you're kind of putting yourself aside, because obviously we've worked hard on these things. We've created these amazing worlds. We've created these scenarios, and we've worked really hard on them, and we want them to be appreciated. But if somebody has a problem with something in your world, or something that you've done inadvertently or not, that's not the time to be like, well, I worked really hard on this, blah, 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 blah. Like, how dare you? Like, they have a very real and valid reason for feeling the way that they do, as do you. So kind of putting yourself to the side just for a moment and kind of going, hey, friend, like, we're friends first, right? That's the important part. Even if you meet at the gaming table and you establish the friendship afterwards, you're still friends first. And I feel like it does bear mentioning that, like, you got to be a little humble. They're not trying to attack you. They're not doing this because they hate you and hate your game. Like, there's just something about it that happened that was a miscommunication or was difficult for them that just needs to be addressed. You know, you might, in the case of the grisly murder scene I mentioned earlier, you might think that's the coolest, most amazing thing you've ever written ever in the history of ever. And you might be right. But, like, is it worth it if the people you love and want to game with are uncomfortable or hate it? You know, is that really worth it at the end of the day?
Yeah.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, I think kind of on that note, there are two things that I think have really helped me as a game designer that you need to keep in mind when you're doing this sort of thing. The first is you are not your game. You know, you've put a lot of work into your game. You put a lot of thought and love into it, but it's not you. Your game is not you as a person. If someone is criticizing your game, that's not the same as criticizing you. And if you can manage to keep that distinction in your head, it will help you to receive critique so much better.
Yeah.
The other thing is you probably aren't going to get it right the first time.
Impossible.
Part of the game design process for video games is iterations. You know, the very first thing you do is bad. That the first game that you're making is bad. That's just how it works. You know, you're not some sort of all-seeing, all-knowing, perfect individual. So you put it out there, and then you test it, and you figure out what's working well and what's working not. And then the next iteration, you change things that weren't working well. You improve things that were working good. That's how it works. So, and if you recognize that this game that you made isn't perfect and could be improved, and that's okay, and that's normal, and that's part of the process, then that also makes it a lot easier to accept critique from other people.
That's true.
Yeah, very much so. And if you can keep that in mind, you can adjust things so much better. Like, and we've had this example in GTP itself. In 2022, I ran for Extra Life, that RP game and it was on Twitch, and everyone was having a fun time on it, and that's because because me then could easily adapt and knew which ways I wanted the game to go for the way that those players wanted to play it, without needing, and most of everyone, I didn't need to do much of a discussion, but I knew exactly what I was needing to do for that. But me, when I'm first starting out, years ago, oh good lord, some of those mistakes are horrible. So as long as you're able to adapt and accept critique when it's needed, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Sort of on that, another way to avoid that, and this is something I kind of wanted us to talk about, was, are you running a pre-made adventure, or are you running one that you have made yourself from scratch? There are a lot of pre-made adventures out there. Some of them better than others. Some of them are professionally published specifically to work with a specific system that's very popular or not very popular. Some of them are intentionally vague and meant to be adapted to whatever system. But there are so many out there to choose from. And that could be a good way of dealing with critique, because, oh, this game sucked. It's okay. That's not my fault. Whoever wrote this adventure, they're the ones that screwed up.
And there's a lot of discourse about whether or not one should run a pre-made or homebrew themselves. And there's a bunch of different camps and different thoughts and feelings about it. Like, there's no one right answer.
Yeah.
The right answer, as Rob said earlier, is whatever works for you and whatever your players want to engage with. You know, if you don't have time to write a homebrew amazing epic fantasy, like, I get it. We're all hustling out here.
Yeah.
It's okay to pick up a book and go, well, chapter 7 says this, so that's what we're going with.
If you do run a pre-made adventure, though, a word of warning: it isn't necessarily less work than running a homebrew one. I mean,
True.
you
Yes.
don't. In a sense, it's less work because you don't have to come up with so much stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's no work. You should still read the entire adventure all the way through before you run it at least once, probably 2 or 3 times.
And then I would recommend whatever session you have planned for that specific day, reread that section. You know, so if they're in the middle of an adventure, they're in a dungeon, and you know they're coming up on a couple of rooms that you kind of remember there are some monsters or something in there. Reread those rooms before you run the game.
Mhm.
It'll help. I
It'll
promise
help.
you. I promise you, it'll help.
I guess we
Read it before you run the game, and then right before the game, you read it again. Not the whole adventure, just the parts that you need.
Yeah.
But
I guess we should discuss this. So when some of us are setting up our games and such, there's different sort of styles for it, and each one of us runs it a little bit differently. For example, for me, I take a note when I wanted to plan the game mastering game. I take a notebook out. I just write down the key parts that I need to write down because I'm pretty good at improving, so I don't want to lean heavily on my I guess script, on my storyline. But that way I can let it flow, where if a player makes a certain decision, I can just move it around here. But when it comes to preparing for a new game, that's basically all I do. I just take notes to know what things I want to have in this game and where it goes. A lot of times I come up with the ending first and then the beginning, and the rest in the middle becomes a muddle mess.
Interesting.
But that's my sort of flow for it. Work at the start, end, and then how we get there.
Yeah, I mean, as a GM now, it's rare for me to fully flesh out everything that's going to happen. I rely pretty heavily on improvisation during my sessions. That's just how I am as a GM. But that wasn't always the case. You know, early on in my GMing career, I prepared so much. I had pages and pages and pages. That Endless Night campaign that Leo mentioned, I think was something like 50 pages long.
Yeah.
It was a lot. And as I went on, I became more comfortable with having things undecided that I could just make up on the fly in session. And for me, that was helpful. As a new GM, I would kind of recommend preparing a little bit more than you think you're going to need, simply because having something already prepared ahead of time makes it so that you don't have to freak out so much when something surprising happens mid-session and you're not ready for it. You know, improvisation is a learned skill, and you learn it with preparation. It's when you're improving, you're doing the exact same things that you do when you're preparing ahead of time. You're just doing it faster.
Yeah. And this is not necessarily necessary. That's a stupid phrase. But don't be afraid. If you want to improve skills like improv, feel free to go take an improv class. Look one up in your local area. You know, improv is a learned skill, as Rob said, and it's not something that comes naturally to everybody. And no one, hopefully, no one is expecting you to be the next Matthew Mercer or Brennan Lee Mulligan or, you know, any of these amazing other DMs and creators out there. And if they are, they need to kind of re-examine their reality. Not all of us are amazingly talented voice actors.
Yeah.
But you don't need to do voices necessarily. And if improv is something that you're not great at, like maybe you just focus on the story or the combat or what have you. Maybe you do a little bit more prep because you know that improv is not your strong suit. But again, if you want to get better at these things, watch a video on it, take a class on it, interface with other people, and just be goofy, be silly. You know, get together with some of your other friends and just be like, "Hey guys, I want to work on this improv," or you know, play improv games, things like Telestrations.
Oh, Telestrations is a good one.
It's not really like an improv based game, but like you're thinking on the fly, you're thinking quickly, you're having to draw or respond to something that has been drawn. So it gives you like a prompt and a response to respond back to, as an example. You know, these are all things you can work on, but don't ever feel like you need to be a professional at these things, because the majority of people, and even the people who are famous for these things, have other things that they're not as good at.
Yeah.
Every DM, every GM has their own strength, has their own ability to create something wholly unique to them. And it may be that you do amazing character voices, or that you have an amazing storyline, or that you have some combination of all of these things. But I guarantee you there's something that you don't feel you're as strong about, that somebody else's game might be a little bit stronger than you are in it. You can improve, of course. I'm not saying you can't. But don't feel like, oh, well, I can't do voices, so what's the point? Like, not everyone needs voices in their game. And that's okay.
Especially early on. Like, if you're doing a first session, you know what? Every single character sounds like this. That's me. Everyone's going to be this because I don't want to bother with that.
And that's okay. Like, if you'd rather put your points elsewhere, right? Leo, if you're putting your points into the storyline or the combat or the learning the rules of the game, even, it's okay if everyone just sounds like this. Like, hey, I'm Mary. What's up? Yeah, cool. Oh, hey, I'm Jim now. Yeah, Jim sounds a lot like Mary. I know. We're all related in this town. All of us. We all sound the same. A wizard did it. I don't know.
And you don't even need to get into those kind of excuses for it.
No, you don't.
But yeah, just go with it. Lean on your strengths more. The first session I have ever made, I wrote down everything as if it was a linear story. And when I ran the Extra Life campaign, I told every player beforehand, this is on rails. And this is a linear story. And they knew it going in. And the reason why I told them that is because that way they know it wasn't that if you want to explore these other places, don't bother. It's not happening. You're going forward. Enjoy. And that was a blast.
You had a limited time. The scope of the game was what it was.
It was a one-shot, limited time. And it was, and I literally put it in a cave that goes straight. That was half that game. But, that's the scope I wanted to work with. And everyone had a blast on that.
And because you were upfront with that, people could engage in that in that way. And it was a fun time for everybody.
I think I did I did no voices for it. Everyone sounded the same too. Even the bat sounded like me.
Yeah. And that didn't stop me from having fun.
So yeah, moving on from that section, it's probably the other one is have a general idea what is and is not allowed in the game. And what I mean by this is sort of both actions and objects that is allowed or not allowed in the game for it. Actions are a little different, just like we mentioned before. You talk to your players what things you want them that you don't want to happen in the game, or you do, or whatever, right? Objects are a little different on that, in that if a player wants to have like a laser rifle, but we're in a 20s noir setting, you're not gonna have it. Sometimes it'll in between. If I'm I did this early on. It's if you can figure out how to make it in the game, fine. I'll let it slide.
Yeah, and maybe it's that you don't have it in the way that you're thinking of, right? So to use the 1920s laser gun example, Fallout is very much so a genre of game that exists, right? So there is a precedence for it, but if it's not the kind of game that people are interested in playing or the DM is interested in running, that could be difficult. But maybe there's a way, through mad science that you can get a lightning gun, or something that is laser adjacent. It may not be what you're 100% hoping for as a player, but compromise is a good thing. In this case,
how does that go? If it's like, I want a lightsaber, you can't have a lightsaber in this game. All right, what about a sonic laser-based sword?
Yeah,
fine.
Exactly.
Exactly.
It's maybe not 100% what you're hoping for. Maybe there's different drawbacks or different, pros and cons to it. But at the end of the day, it's closer to a laser gun than you might have gotten otherwise.
And sometimes some interesting systems on there will like in Dungeons & Dragons, for example, you have to deal with gold, silver, electrium.
Yeah,
electrum and copper. And I'll be honest, whenever I play Dungeons & Dragons, I hate doing that kind of math. So everyone gets gold. Down to that peasant over there, that's gold.
Basically, every system I've ever run that does not come with a predefined cost for things, I just use dollars.
Sure.
I might call it gold, but 1 gold equals $1. That's
or
gold, gil, Double dollars, Wulongs.
Wulongs, yeah. Cortex has an interesting one. Money isn't even a concept for it, but lifestyle is. Can your character get their hands on this? That's what they decide on. That
it's not necessarily that you have X amount of money that you can spend on Y amount of goods and Z, like your room or whatever.
Mhm.
It's you basically set your lifestyle. Yeah, my character lives in poverty, so it's difficult for me to get things. My character lives lavishly, wealthily, and so it's easy for them to get these sort of things. And that's just part of the character.
Mhm.
And that way we have abstracted money out. Nobody has to do math. Side note, most people don't like to do math. That's, like you're not alone if you were in your math class and having trouble keeping up. That's like 90% of the human race.
Shout out to the weird math people, though, and I say weird as a term of endearment. I don't understand you, but I'm really glad you're there when I need to, like, calculate an angle. Or, I'm like, okay, this character's like 40 feet in the air,
Mhm.
and you're shooting at a 45-degree angle, and they're like, oh, it's 4. And I'm like, sure, yeah.
Why not?
Checks out.
But like on that note, just don't make your players do math.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Some people like it, most people don't.
Well, it depends on what kind of game you're running too, right? So, like, if you're looking for like a very crunchy, West Marches or more realistic style game, there are some DMs I know for D&D who run these amazing, realistic. Like, you count how many arrows you shoot,
Mhm.
you count how many rations you have in your pack when you're out in the wilderness. You keep track of these things, and there are some people. There's a subset of people out there who love that type of gameplay.
Oh yeah.
Personally, I don't want to have to go to town every, 2 sessions or 3 sessions to be like, hey, could I get like 40 arrows? Oh, I can only afford 20? Okay, I better mark that down. I've got 3 left, and I've got 23. Like, that's a lot for me.
Mhm.
But if that's your kind of game, there's somebody out there, or maybe you should run that game because there are people who will want to play that game.
There is people.
Yeah, if all you and your buddies are the math nerds, run Shadowrun. That's it's very math heavy and very crunchy, and that is exactly what you would want for a group of people that really love math.
Or one of the Mech Warrior ones.
Sure.
Like, honestly, the amount of number crunching required for some of those mech games, someone's like, hey, why don't you run the game master? All right, got the manual, so I needed to keep track of 16 different hit points for one target. I'm out. That's just way more math than I'm willing to put up with for this one.
For you math nerds, please run Shadowrun and then explain to me how to run Shadowrun.
Mm-hmm.
I would appreciate that.
Shadowrun's on a like it's funny because Nibblestarf, and he's been on the Steve Nibblestarf, who's been on this podcast several times. That was what introduced him to tabletop games, not traditionally Dungeons and Dragons, where most people get. He got introduced to Shadowrun, and he does sometimes love the number crunching.
Sure.
And I'm sitting there,
I mean,
but he can't. He doesn't want to game master. I'm like, I want you to game master because you can handle the numbers for Shadowrun, so I can play Shadowrun for once in my life.
Like, I grew up in 2nd edition D&D that had this thing called THAC0, which is to hit armor class 0. And there are charts and graphs that you have to, like, reference in order to understand the basic fundamentals of this Dungeons and Dragons game. It's not like 5th edition. It's a lot more streamlined, which is awesome. I love that 5th edition is more streamlined. But yeah, like, you had to, like, sit there and be like, okay, I've got a this to hit, and then I got to calculate this thing, and to hit their armor class 0, it's, this number, and negative armor class is better than positive armor class because the more negative your armor class is, the harder you were to hit. Like, it was just a whole thing, right? And I grew up doing that. I don't miss doing that necessarily. I really like being like, does an 18 hit? And someone's like, yeah. That's pretty nice.
It's really nice to have that leveler there.
As opposed to being like pulling out my charts and graphs and like comparing and contrasting. I don't know.
Everyone got their pencils, papers, and calculators for this game.
Yeah.
Oh man. But yeah, there's different systems that will allow you to do that. And then in that vein, there's things that the players might want.
Yeah.
I think that is mostly what all the big ones that I can think of for what a basic things that are new coming in Game Master would want to deal with. right?
Yeah.
Unless you guys have something else that you could think of on that.
One thing I'd like to mention, as a new DM or a new GM, don't feel like you have to have everything plotted out. If you do, that's amazing. If you have the whole plot, if you have the bad guys, the villains of the arc, if you've got twists and turns and everything all planned out, that's something. That's cool. That's fine. You can have that. But I took a long hiatus to tabletop RPGs after college, in kind of a silly manner, and had decided that I was done with it. When I came back to it, I had to kind of relearn what I thought I needed to do and what I needed to do. And so for me, I created, and there are other people on the internet who have said the same advice. So if you've heard this elsewhere, I find it's good advice. Start small. If you are making a Dungeons and Dragons game and you have level 1 players, and maybe they've played before, maybe they haven't played before, maybe they just haven't played in a while, create a small town. It's got an inn, it's got a blacksmith, it's got a butcher's shop, it's got this thing, it's got that thing, and then just create them one by one. So for me, I created a small town called Candlewood for my homebrew campaign, and I made the inn first. It was the first thing I made. What does this inn look like? Who's in it? What are the patrons' names, if any? What is the bartender's name? And what is their purpose? What are they doing there? And then I went, okay, well, if there's an inn here, there should be some way of like sourcing food. So who else lives here? Well, some farmers. Okay, what do they farm? Oh, they farm this thing. Where do they sell it? Oh, they sell it at this small market that happens every weekend. And on and on and on and on. You can just extrapolate out after that. But start small. Create a town. Create some people in that town. And then you can create your kingdoms and your empires and your adversaries and whatever. It can be as complicated as it needs to be, but don't be afraid to start small.
I mean,
because most adventurers start small.
Yeah, odds are good. Your players are really only going to be dealing with what's in front of them.
Yeah, for a while at least.
If they're there in the small town and that's where your adventure starts, then the needs of the small town are what matters to them. That's what they're going to be dealing with. Does it matter what the kingdom is like and their politics and how the nobles are interacting? Probably not. Those things don't affect the people out here in the small podunk town of Candlewood. They might later, after you've taken care of Candlewood's problems, then you might want to start looking at some court intrigue or something like that. But you don't have to have everything all at once.
No. What do they care about the nobles, as you said, when they're starving because of the crop shortage and it's been weirdly happening, or what have you?
Okay. So before I close up, one thing I wanted to mention, and this is just in general for things, one of the things you want to be careful of, or not careful, but aware of, is your players. Your players have choices that they will make. If you can understand what your players' choices are, or how they like to play, you can kind of tailor your game towards it. I know I do this sometimes, and it's just mostly for funsies. So I kind of wanted to go over a small list of different kind of types of players that you'll run into. Like sort of the pros and cons real quick on that. Some of the ones I know of is the straight up fighter. Every solution is punching. Punching is the solution for it. Now, the problem with that is punching is the solution for everything. So maybe they have a kind noble who's been helping out and wants to talk to you guys, but doesn't want to give up information. All of a sudden, now we're in a fight for no reason.
Yeah.
So, if you're clever enough as a game master, you can sometimes put them into a place where they can't punch their way out of the solution. So one of my favorite players I had to deal with was a fighter. Kept doing that. As a game master, I put him in a situation where fighting couldn't solve it. I watched as this guy cleverly figured out a way to social his way out of this mess with the bad stats that he has, and it was so fun for him that after that he couldn't stop wanting to play a social based character because he's never experienced that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Challenging your players to get outside of their comfort box. And to try something else or try something new is a very good thing. However, I do want to caution there is a chance that if you try to push and you push too hard, that same player may just shut down
Mm-hmm.
and may stop engaging because they're just here to swing sticks and punch people in the face. Like, that's an acceptable way to play a game if that's the kind of game you're playing. But just keep in mind that like that approach could have two very drastically different end results.
I mean, there's a lot of different types of players. There's a lot of different organizations of types of players. Even if you aren't running a session in D&D, it's a good idea to look through D&D's DM manual, 4th or 5th edition. Both have some great ways where they talk about the different types of players that you might experience, how you might engage those players, the things that you should watch out for. On the internet, there's a lot of different categories that they put players into. The real man, the real role player, the loony sort of thing. And there's some great resources that you can look up to, or you can look for what types of players there are and how you can prep your games for. And really, what I feel though to watch out for is very few players are one type of player.
Yes.
There are very few people that are just like, I only want to role play. I never want to fight. I never want to do anything crazy or silly. I only want to do serious role playing. That's incredibly rare for you to run into that. A lot of times you'll have the player that I really love role playing, but we've done that kind of a lot. I'd really like to punch a monster in the face now. I normally have very serious, well thought out plans, but sometimes I want to try something a little bit crazy and out there. Most players are going to be a mix of these different types, and they're going to want different things at different times. That's okay. That's normal. That's people. That's how they work. So, don't necessarily feel like you're one player. You have to cater to this one thing that they want to do all the time. It's okay to branch out.
Yeah. Some players are fighters where they just want to fight, but they also want to branch out once in a while. You have, I had a player once that I like to nickname the historian. They wanted to find out the lore of this world. I'm like, okay, but we spent like half an hour talking to this one historian. Let's move on and such. And there's ways to push them out of that being stuck on there. There's people who I like to nickname the detective. They are all about puzzle solving. And so the nice juxtaposition is they're the opposite of your fighter character. The fighter wants to fight, the detective just wants to solve puzzles.
Yeah. I love shopping episodes.
Yeah.
But I've got friends who loathe shopping episodes.
I'm one of those friends. I hate shopping episodes in D&D with the biggest passion ever.
Yeah, and I think they're great because I get to be weird and I get to hang out and I get to like haggle. It's incredible to me. But yeah, much like Rob, there are people out there who are just like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that at all.
Yeah, so these are sort of a general list of the things. There's two types that would probably be the toughest ones that you'll want to deal with, but be aware of them. And they're not bad, but they're ones that can enter. One of them I like to call the hanger-on, or the witness, or the rent. This is the person who came to hang out with their friends here. They weren't in for the session. And it can be kind of tricky because essentially because of this, they may pick weird decisions on it, but they're decisions that don't go anywhere. Or and this is not a detriment to any game master or even any player who does it. It's just sort of the thing that happens. They don't feel like they're engaging into the game. That's not a bad thing. It's just that you want to be aware with it. If that's a thing that's happening, one thing to do is to either limit their scope or to move around them. Because essentially, you're trying to ask, like, X person, hey, okay, so what do you want to do here? I guess punch the guy. And that's the only thing that you can think of because that's the quickest solution on that.
Yeah, and like you said, there's nothing really wrong with a player that's just there to hang out with friends and isn't particularly interested in the game. That's not really an issue, Occasional prodding, like, hey, do you wanna maybe do this? Just plan around it. Don't make them the focus. That's not what they're here for.
Yeah, and as mentioned previously, check in outside of the session with them, one-on-one, and just be like, hey, are you having fun? Is there anything I could do better? Is there anything I could do to include you more? Is there something else that you're maybe more interested in terms of, are you a combat character? Are you a social character? Are you neither? And like, you need to preface with them that there's no right answer. You're not looking for something here. You just want to make sure that you are maximizing or trying to emphasize their fun in addition to the rest of the groups. if they're not engaging quite as much.
And sometimes they'll surprise you. One of the in one session or game I was running with this new person, and they didn't say much. They didn't do anything. At the end, I'm like, oh man, I got to check in with him later after this game and figure out. And was blasting on like social media. Oh man, I had the greatest time on this RP. I'm like, you did you did like 2 things. What the?
Yeah,
And
that was
that
enough
was
for
enough
them,
for
which is
them. They're
awesome.
awesome. It's like it's not a bad thing. The other one you want
Yeah.
to worry about is sort of the Chaos Bringer, or also known as the Loony, the one who wants to try anything and everything that's out there. Some of the funniest things that happen when people go crazy like that. Also, some of the worst things that happen in your game is because of the same exact thing.
Yeah, chaos can be interesting because it's unpredictable, but can also be devastating because it's unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
And there are consequences in almost every game system. There are consequences to the chaos. You know, if you are being crazy and unpredictable and LOL so random in front of, you know, the Archduke of Space, yeah, they might take exception to that, and they might treat you and your group differently because of that interaction. You know, don't be afraid as the DM or GM. You don't want to punish your players. You never want to necessarily punish your players, but you can react to the things that they're doing in the world that you're creating. Because I think most people, unless you're running like a one-shot or a small form game, are interested in creating a lived-in feeling type world that feels, for lack of a better term, real.
Mm-hmm.
So it would make sense that, you know, if you're like juggling knives in front of the Space Duke, that like, yeah, he might not love that.
Yeah, might not be a fan.
Or she or they, you know.
And really the way to resolve this is just to have kind of a variety. And that's just a good design principle in general when you're talking about any sort of game. You don't want it to be all combat all the time. You don't want it to be all serious all the time. You don't want it to be all jokes all the time. You know, just if you've got a player that wants to bring some chaos, make sure you've got an encounter that kind of relies on that uses some out of the box thinking, that does something kind of silly and wacky and gives them an opportunity. So that they have an outlet for that thing that they really want to do. They have an outlet for their chaos. And then separately have a different encounter that's maybe a little bit more serious for your role player. Separately have a different encounter that's really going to rely heavily on combat for your fighter player. It's called pacing.
Yeah.
And you have some moments that are a little bit more intense, some moments that are a little bit less intense, some moments that require you to think one way, some moments that require you to think another. It keeps your players engaged because there's different things to do. It keeps you from getting burnout because it's not the same thing over and over again.
And I guess that's sort of the way that you want to handle these kind of players, but if you can. And none of these are bad or anything on that. I guess to my final, so, you know, they play, they're just humans and people too. One of the things that you want to do, and this is sort of a, you know, and you'll probably never, ideally you'll never bump into this, but we've all bumped into this, which is known as that guy, which is, and this is my last note on this. That guy is the guy who wants to basically, they're here to make sure that they have fun, but nobody else has fun. And they will do some destructive things to your game. Set them aside, talk to them. The name of the game for any tabletop is to have fun and enjoyment. And if someone's ruining that fun and enjoyment, you as the game master should deal with this one way or another.
Yeah, and as a DM, don't be afraid to, in session 0, after you've talked about what people do want, what people don't want, what you don't want, and if you've come to a consensus, don't be afraid to set down rules, you know, about this sort of thing. One of the rules that I use typically at my table is, you know, don't infringe upon anyone else's fun, and your fun will not be infringed upon, or something along those lines. Where, like, as long as we're all having a good time, having fun, and not breaching the social contract that we're entering into, there's no issue. We can do whatever we want. But as soon as you're like hurting somebody else's fun in pursuit of your own, then we're going to have an issue.
Yeah, I think there's sort of an expectation that when you have a problem player, it's your duty as the GM to fix it. And that can be scary if you're maybe not so great about, you know, if you're an introvert and you don't really like conflict and you don't necessarily want to confront somebody in real life about their behavior. That's understandable. It can be pretty difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go it alone. Talk to your players, all of your players. Discuss how to approach this problem, and give the problem player a chance to defend themselves. But it's okay if they're a problem and they're not willing to compromise, or if they say they're going to compromise and then don't. It's okay to kick them out. That happens sometimes. It's not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, try to avoid having that happen. I don't think anyone wants to have that talk. That sucks. But as previously stated, there are some people who are not looking for the type of game you want to run, or there are some people whose play style is different than the game you want to run, or maybe your DM style is not the right fit for them as a player. So, as Rob said, try to compromise, try to come to a consensus, do what you can. But at the end of the day, you do have that button.
Yeah.
You can eject or seat those people, or anyone for that matter, at any time.
Yeah.
Just, I would caution, use it sparingly if you can.
Like, I've had to before and bounce people out of my campaign before. It's not fun. I've had to bounce people out of other people's campaign because they were so introverted, but they needed this to happen. Like, I got you.
There was a forum that I used to go to frequently, where it was basically a motto that they came up with, that no gaming is better than bad gaming. And so you might be afraid to eject a problem player because it might mean the end of the game for a little bit. That does happen sometimes. Yeah. But just remember that a little bit of courage for a few minutes as you're confronting a problem player will lead to a much better outcome. That scary thing that you have to do when you're dealing with a problem player for a few minutes is better than having to put up with them for a year's worth of sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if it's infringing on your and other people's funds.
It's a scary moment, and you, as a game master, might be the one who's in charge for it. But some of us have been here. We'll back you up. It's fine.
Yeah. I will say too, if you're looking for more information like this, I've mentioned before, there's a lot of people out there who have some things like this. I really enjoy a number of people that are kind of based in the D20 sphere. So like D&D and D20 Modern, those sort of games. But I know that Dimension 20 crew, so Brendan Lee Mulligan, Lou Wilson, all those amazing people, they have videos where they talk about these sort of things in sort of like a kind of like this. Mm-hmm. And they brought up the idea of the snack captain. Oftentimes, we as game masters forget to eat. We get distracted. We're busy running the game, and they put forth the idea that like one person, if there's a person in your group who likes logistics, who likes planning things, let them be the snack captain. Buy them a hat, but like they're the ones who've got the food situation settled. If you want to do food at your game, you don't have to. But I think the idea of the snack captain can be broadened to the game in general, right? Don't feel like you as the DM have to do everything, that you have to plan the game sessions, that you have to wrangle the people together, that you have to get everyone in the same room, that you have to set up the scene and then have to run the game and provide food and figure that out. Like, it's a lot. Feel free to allow other people to help you if they want to. Don't strong arm them into it. But if you've got somebody who wants to handle the snacks, if your group likes snacks, call that out. Like, hype that up. They're the snack captain. They're amazing, and they deserve to be pointed to in a good way and go like, thank you, Jim, for being the snack captain. I appreciate you doing this. Thank you, Megan, for planning the session, for deciding and getting everyone's ideas together and deciding what day we were going to do this game. Because I'm over here trying to create gods, and it's hard.
I remember one person, I had to go, thank you to Lois here, who remembered to bring 800 things of dice.
Yeah. And you don't necessarily need to like call them out like round robin, like, and thank you to Bill for being awesome. Like, you don't need to call them all out. But like, you
also don't need to burden it all in your own shoulders.
Yeah. It's not all on you. We're all friends. We're all group here. We're all here for the same thing. Like, we can all try to like figure this out. Thank your snack captains. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, one thing we were discussing relatively recently in one of my game design classes is how important the producer role is when
Yeah.
you're making a game, and that's essentially what you're talking about with a snack captain. Is somebody who takes care of all the little stuff to make sure, like outside of game, that happens. They're not necessarily making the creative decision about what world you're playing in,
Mhm.
or what the bad guy is or what he's doing. They're just facilitating you so that you can do that, and they are indispensable. They really are.
Yeah.
So if you've got someone that can handle that, that enjoys doing that sort of thing, absolutely let them do their thing.
Yeah. And now, don't feel like you have to be that person either. You don't have to be the snack captain. Just to be clear, like there does not always necessarily need to be a snack captain, but like if that's your jam and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna make sure we eat. Thank you, whoever you are.
We seriously
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Or you're like, I'm a type A personality. This is the schedule. This is what all 12 of us have said works for us. We're playing on this game at this time. Thank you.
For everybody who was willing to let me run a game in their home,
Yes.
I appreciate
Thank
you.
Thank you for having more space than my tiny apartment.
Exactly. About wrapping it up, anyone else's final thoughts to helping out a new game master?
There was a story I read a long time ago where someone was talking about how they were scared of running their first session, and they really didn't have it fleshed out. And the players just kind of went off the rails immediately, and they explored the town, and they did this and that. And one of them burned down a tree, and then they got into this big argument with the local guards, and they were going to get arrested, and da 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 da. And at the end, they were just like, "Is there something we can do to get out of this legal trouble that we've gotten into ourselves?" I was like, "Oh, actually, there's this goblin," and that's the encounter that the GM had originally planned for them to go to that they had been ignoring. Hey, there's this goblin camp down the road that could really use taking care of. And the moral of the story is, don't worry. Worst case scenario, your players spend a few hours arguing about a tree.
Oh, true.
So
Like
true.
it's really easy when you're first starting out to imagine all the worst case scenarios. And just remember, like, really, the worst case scenario is your friends spend an evening doing something that isn't particularly fun.
Mhm.
That's not the end of the world. You will absolutely be able to bounce back from that.
I've mentioned this a couple of times myself, and I've told my players this verbatim that, like, yeah, if you all want to be sheep herders, if that's the kind of game you want to play, we will run the best sheep herding D&D game of your life. I will come up with encounters. I will come up with, plot points. We will use your stats. It'll be ridiculous, but we'll do it. Like, I have things planned. I have things that I want to do as the DM. I've got a story that I have in mind. But if you want to be sheep herders, we're herding sheep, y'all. Let's go. To kind of go along with that, do not ever be afraid that you're going to make a mistake, because you will. 100% you will. And that's okay. I think the phrase goes, you have to be bad at something to be sort of okay at something one day, to eventually be good at something. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think there's a lot of pressure in our society and just in the world in general to be an expert out the gate day one. You know everything. You've seen everything. You've done everything. You are the consummate expert. And that's just unrealistic. Do not be afraid to fail, because it's when we fail that we learn, that we grow. And to that effect, much like the goblin thing, those players were running around all crazy. There was a brief pause, the situation changed, and then the DM or the GM could put forth their initial plan from there. As the GM, you hold control of this world. If you have two paths and down the left one is, danger zone, and down the right one is fields of gold and plenty, and they go down the left path, okay, well, they go through danger zone. But then maybe instead of that second path leading to, gold and plenty, maybe it's because they went through the dangerous path, that just beyond the dangerous path is the land of gold and plenty.
Mm-hmm.
You can move things. You can take things that you've made, and it sounds ridiculously common, and like everyone should understand this, but you can take something you've made and just move it wherever you need it. It doesn't matter if it was like, oh, they fight the skeleton, then the zombie, then the knight, then the evil wizard. Like, if they jump straight to the evil wizard, you can have those other characters show up afterwards or whatever, or later. Maybe they're not even a part of that fight now. The general is now even more powerful because the wizard was the only person who held them in check or whatever. You can adapt. You can move things forward. Just keep pushing. Just keep trying. And I guarantee you, you will get better.
All right. Now, that being said, our next episode that will be coming out for Gaming Theater Podcast will be on March 3rd, which will be the beginning of our season finale. And for those who are interested in what that would be, it's going over a brief history about the last 100+ years of animation. And it's sort of a weird tale of yours to where we started to where we get here. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Gaming Theater Podcast. And we hope that these little helpful hints help you out. With that being said, this is Gaming Theater Podcast, logging out. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Gaming Theater Podcast is hosted, created, produced, and edited by Leo Garcia, the Geek Scorpio. Our music is A Drinking Game. Stock media provided by Stormwave Audio /Pond5. Our cover art is by Adam Parker. You can find him at ParkerGFX on Twitter. If you want to send us some financial support to help with producing things for Gaming Theater, you can do so at patreon.com/gamingtheaterpresents. It helps us out. Want to send support that doesn't hit your wallet? Please leave a review with wherever you hear your podcasts and share our podcast with your friends. It really helps out. Thank you for listening.